Well, welcome everybody to this month's presentation, a webinar for the Australian Non-Profit Accounting Standards Research Program. My name's David Gilchrist. I'm the Director of the program here at UWA, and I'd like to welcome Angela Liew, who's going to give a presentation today on digging into the ins and outs of interview-based qualitative research. Angela has a wide and deep experience in this area, and I've heard her speak on this before too, which is just fantastic. So I'll hand over to you, Angela. Angela will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll be ready to take questions. But also, if you wish to, please put your questions in the chat box at the top of the screen, and we can deal with those when we get to the end of the presentation. We are recording the presentation too, which means that will be available for people to access after the session via the website. Over to you, Angela. Welcome and thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, David. So let's get started. So interview qualitative research, what is it? So it's basically, in terms of qualitative research, we're talking about data analysis being performed on the words, sentences, or meanings of the words. So they're analysis not based on numbers instead. So that's the broad definition. So in today's agenda, what I'm going to go through is start with the data sources and is focusing specifically on surveys and interviews, the two sort of more common used data sources. And I'll talk through the research onion, the different research strategy behind qualitative research, especially to do with interview based, and also looking into the difference between positivists versus interpretivists when it comes to this type of study. And we'll come back and look at the different types of questions that people tends to have sort of confusion or misconception between interview questions, research question, and the survey question, and how you sort of put it all together in one nutshell. And we'll finish off with how many interview quotes should one be having, and how do you actually go about describing the findings in your actual write-up. So with that agenda in mind, let's start with the data sources. So I call this the four quadrant of the data sources in terms of qualitative and quantitative. And qualitative is based on the words, quantitative is based on the numbers. And in terms of the way we split it is really to do with those that requires ethics approval process and those that didn't require ethics approval. So when we're looking at qualitative, we've got interviews, we've got observation, when that requires ethics approval. For those that don't require it, if we were going for archival records or publicly available data, you could get away without asking people for permission because you can readily get access to them online or in the library and etc. When it comes to quantitative and with numbers, a lot of people sort of have this misconception because the most common one is the databases and archival, and that doesn't require ethics. But when it comes to survey and experiments, you do require ethics. So it doesn't matter qualitative or quantitative, depending on how and what sort of data sources you are collecting, you are likely to have to go through that ethics approval process. Now, the other thing it's important to understand, when we talk about qualitative research, we are trying to address the how and the why when it comes to a research question and what it's asking for. Whereas in the quantitative, we're trying to get hold of the what and the how much behind what we're trying to uncover. Now, when it comes to popularity, in terms of qualitative, it tends to be interviews and observation that's quite popular among the qualitative research, whereas for the quantitative research, the most popular one tends to be databases and archival. And that's often where the misconception thinking that, a qualitative tends to be interview only because that's the most popular one, and the quantitative being databases and therefore no ethics is required because that is also the most popular one. So that's something quite important to understand why there may be misconception. It's largely to do with the popularity in terms of how commonly being used. So with that data sources in mind, there are all sorts of data sources we could look into depending on qualitative or quantitative that you are analysing on. We're going to start with looking specifically at interviews, but with this comparison to the surveys. And the reason why I like to use survey as a comparison is most people tend to be familiar with surveys, not necessarily because they design a survey, but most likely because they've been asked to fill in a survey. So you're quite familiar because you've seen them in the sort of happening to you, being emailed to you, and etc. Let's start with the survey. Now, with the survey, you send out the survey, you send the reminder to the survey, and you hope that you'll get the responses, and you check the responses and retain the responses, and you analyze them. But most universities do require that you go through the ethics approval, and then that means you do need to go through the preparation phase, such as doing the literature review so that you design the survey questions, but you also have to identify which sample population you're going for in order to tell that to the ethics committee as to what you're going to do and who you're getting it from before you actually send out the surveys. So that's basically in terms of the process in which you do it. And one of the key things to understand is even in the survey question, it's important to use simple English, simple words. Otherwise, people might get a bit confused as to what's going on. So when the responses you get back, what is important is you need to identify the sample population that helps you to get to the point where the end result is more than what you're looking for. Because statistically, to be considered sound, that you have a valid study in on hand means you must have more than 30 valid responses. And in order to get more than 30 valid responses, surely your population in which you're going for has to start with something that is big enough that allows you to get more than 30 valid responses at the end of the day. And you've got to be careful. What is the likelihood of your responses? And very often, in Australia, New Zealand, response rate could be as low as 10% or even lower. So you really need to have that in mind when you're designing it in order to work out how big is your sample population to start with? And if you only got 10% response rate, could you get enough to get more than 30 valid responses to actually produce your study? So that's part of the thing behind survey. Now, in one of the really interesting study that was actually published in one of the accounting and finance journal, one of the papers published in that journal, they've sent it out to 774 members of the ethics committee. Now, what is interesting, having sent out the survey, what was the response rate and thing? They actually received 221 responses, which was great. It was 28.6%. But the problem was that some of the responses couldn't be retained and used in the study. So they ended up having to, remove quite a fair bit of it, and it dropped all the way down to 20% that could be retained to be used and analyzed for the study. So you can imagine that's 8% less, which is quite a big deal in terms of numbers. So these are the things you have to consider when you are designing a survey. So what happens if you are designing an interview in mind? So before we get to that, what is important to understand is this response rate, because that is the issue behind having survey research. And in one particular study that was published in 2018 about survey studies, and that was published in Journal of Management Accounting Research, they found that the response rate had been declining, has been reducing quite a fair bit, especially the more recent year, 2014, 2016, it's gone all the way down to an average of 27% across all the papers that's been published. And they look specifically in the papers published in Journal of Management Accounting Research and also in the Management Accounting Research, these two different journals that publish on management accounting sort of work. So this is quite an interesting phenomenon in the sense that it used to be quite high in the 80s and it got quite good, but it's just gradually dropping. But so if we were using that same trend, If we look at the responses since 2017 and right up to 2022, you could literally predict this is going down and down and down. And so, survey study can be quite problematic when your response rate is so low. Are you comfortable what you've got is actually representative of what's going on? So let's look at interviews. Same sort of process, having to go through that preparation, going through the literature review, coming up with the interview questions from it, also identifying the sample population and going for the ethics approval. The difference is now, instead of sending out a survey, we recruit the case sites. So we approach the companies and ask them for permission. And if they're happy for us to come in, then we need to recruit the participant, the actual individuals. So two separate recruitment process behind the data collection. And so some of the people may agree and speak to you. And once they agree, you schedule the interviews. And once you schedule the interviews, a bit of delay and lag time, eventually, hopefully you get to conduct the interviews and transcribe the interviews in terms of from audio to words, and then go about analyzing and writing it up. So that's pretty much in terms of the process behind that. So this is quite an interesting thing to look at in the sense that it's not that different from the survey. There's a bit of time delay in between the different things that happens, because you do need to make sure you have enough time between somebody agreeing to the interview and actually conducting the interview. And sometimes it could take anything between 2 weeks to 4 weeks delay in terms of setting it up and scheduling forward. And sometimes you'll find at last minute, somebody might fall sick and say to you, look, can we reschedule the meeting, and etc. Now, what I thought would be interesting is to look at the number of interviews that's been published and disclosed in our accounting journals, for example, especially in the more recent ones. So in this particular study, when they looked at 2000 to 2014, they found that in 2014, in terms of all the different studies that come about, not even one disclosed the number of interviews that's been conducted. So it's actually quite an interesting sort of 15 years of study looking into how many interviews being conducted that's been disclosed. Only 64% actually disclose it. And among those that disclose, it's also interesting to look at the median and the mean in terms of how many interviews actually do need to be conducted. And the thing that's also interesting is when you look at the minimum and the maximum, the minimum is as low as only one interview, which is fascinating. And yet the maximum is as high as 189 in these 7 particular journals that are known to have interview-based studies being published. So that's quite a phenomenal in that sense. But if we look at the average and the mean, you'll notice it's sitting around the 25, 26 for the median. And yet for the averages, you'll see it sitting between the 31 to 33 in terms of across the 15 years versus the last sort of more recent 5 years in this particular study. So that's quite an interesting fact in itself in terms of what's going on, because a lot of times people have the misconception that if you're doing interview study, you must have it a lot of interviewees, just like you would in a survey, but that's actually not necessarily the case. And what is also interesting is looking at another discipline, for example, information systems. What in this particular study, they look at 83 interview studies published in the top 5 IS journals, and 3 of the 5 of them are actually listed in the FT50 journal. So quite highly sort of considered journal in that sense. And if we look at what they've discovered, what is quite interesting is they discuss where the data saturation point is when it comes to sample size in interview study. And what is fascinating in that sense, you can look at it and you discover, hey, their averages is not that far different from what is happening in the accounting literature in that sense. And especially even in a single case, sort of study, the average is it's like 23 interviews that's been reported there. And the minimum is actually 4 interviews in a single case, yet the maximum was 200. So it is a big variety and big range in there, but you could sort of get the sense of, hey, you don't have to do too many. And what they've also discovered is they said when it gets to the over 30, there's actually no need to collect more and more and more because you actually already got to the point of data saturation in that sense. So this is quite an interesting one where it's confirming that, hey, in an interview studies, you don't have to do it just like a survey study where you have to keep interviewing people for the sake of increasing their numbers, because you're not likely to get any more new data in that sense to tell the story behind it. So it's actually quite fascinating to look at it between the accounting and the IS disciplines. They are basically finding very similar sort of trend. But what is also interesting is if you're looking at the number of studies, a number of interviews per study, it really varies by the different journal as well, which is very similar to what we found in the accounting journals in itself. So, so that's quite an interesting sort of thing to discover and understand. And therefore, hopefully you don't feel that there is a need for you to push for 200 interviews when even 10 interviews is considered reasonable, because the quartile one was actually only 13 when the median is 23, whereas the upper quartile is 45. So that's quite an interesting sort of understanding in itself in terms of this type of study. Now, when we look at interview-based versus survey study, in a different paper that was published sort of in the early 2000s, they look at the difference between them. And the key thing to understand is the fact that in a survey, yes, they do have a high sample size, but it provide that breadth of what we understand in the population. But in a single case study, even though it is a low sample size, especially single case with only one case, but the depth of it is very important, and which means the richness of the data you collect from the interview study is highly valued, because you might be able to find something that you won't be able to find when you're trying to do too many of them. So you go all the way deeply into what is going on, rather than superficially getting a sense of roughly what is going on. So that pretty much gives you a very sort of extreme between interview study versus survey study. Now, with that in mind, a lot of people talk about, okay, what about if I combine interview with survey together and mix the two together, and hopefully I'll get the perfect solution, which is what we call mixed method. The mixed method is very important that you understand. The definition of a mixed method means it is presenting results collected from both qualitative and quantitative methods. And, the way the papers are published in the journals tend to be heavily quantitative or heavily qualitative based, even if someone's PhD work has been conducted using mixed method. It's just largely to do with page limit that you have to make a decision whether you're going for sort of more quantitative or qualitative, or you're doing a pure sort of 50-50, that kind of thing. So when I say heavily, tends to be about 70-80 versus 20-30, that kind of, 80-20 or 70-30, that kind of scenario. So is interview plus survey mixed method? Now, this is probably one of the misconceptions a lot of students tend to make. Now, if you were doing a pilot study to test and verify your survey in detail, it is not a mix. If you're using interviews after the survey in order to confirm the results, also, it is not a mix. So the point being, if you're using the interview just to make sure that what you are trying to provide or present in terms of survey, then it's not mixed. However, If you are quoting things that's been added additionally, and you actually include the interview quotes and include whatever you discovered in the interviews after the survey, then it could be considered as a mixed method. So very important sort of distinction. It's about how and what results you are presenting in the paper that makes it whether mixed method is being used or not. So looking at the research onion, what is interesting is when we go through and unpeel them, you'll start noticing there are different research strategy one could take within the qualitative research. And most of the qualitative research strategy tends to be focusing on sort of interview-based, that style of study. So looking at these different strategy, what can we come up with? The first thing is important to understand is what is your philosophical assumption, whether you're positivist versus interpretivist. Those two make a big difference in which you go about choosing your research strategy and going forward as well. Within the research strategy, the four more common one tends to be case study, action research, grounded theory, and ethnography. And we'll go through and talk about it a little bit more. And then you, based on the data collection methods, you could be using interviews, but the strategy in itself could also be, every strategy also includes an interview. So it's important to understand these differences actually make the way in which you disclose how you went about doing the actual study. But what is also important to understand, nothing is a linear process, straight line, because you have to keep coming back and forward to readjust, refine, or tweak certain things, including, for example, your model, your theory, and etc. So nothing is a straight line where everything works as you initially planned. So let's go back to the strategy itself. So if we look at the paper, you will get a sense of what the researcher have done. Sometimes they actually tell you in terms of actually spelling it out. Other times they sort of hinted it. But most of the time you'll find that they do disclose the research strategy, especially if they were doing action research, grounded theory, or ethnography. The case studies, sometimes they mention, sometimes they don't necessarily use the word in itself. And from there, you'll see they explain about the sampling and selection, how they went about it. And then they also mention about the collection methods behind how they collected the data. So basically how the data sources went about being collected. They might mention about the analysis, depending on whether they did the coding or not. But then you'll get the sense at the end of the day, whether they're going with the positivist or interpretivist. Now, what is interesting, if most of the time you do not see these two words being mentioned on the paper itself, but you could literally see the emphasis if you read between the lines throughout the paper. And often you'll see, for most authors, they are either a positivist or an interpretivist. Very unlikely you'll see the same author doing two types, because those are very two different sort of mindset in itself. So let's look specifically at the research strategy in more detail. So what is a case study? A case study, regardless single case or multiple case, it's about the researcher going into the field and trying to investigate the development of a particular entity or phenomenon, an event or situation. They go into the field. What about an action research then? The action research basically means the researcher is often a participant in the field, but with the intention to interfere. Now, what is important to understand is if somebody says, oh, what you discover is great, we would love to implement it in our company from what you've discovered. Now, if that conversation comes at the end of it, that is still a case study because the intention was never to interfere or change at the beginning. So action research is a very intentional strategy where the researcher, being often the participant inside the field, has every intention of using the findings to make changes to it. So a very important sort of distinction between the two. So you could literally say, goes into the field. What does that mean? It means we are a visitor. We do not belong to the field, but we come in and out of FEW as a visitor, visiting the situation and reporting on the situation. So what about grounded theory then? Now, grounded theory assumes you have no theory in mind when you go and collect the data, and you're hoping that the whole paper, the whole work, will be grounded based on what you will observe and discover. And you'll find that grounded theory tends to be not only interview, but also has observation involved in there. Whereas ethnography is studying the entire culture by living in the field. So you'll see that happening in a lot of anthropology study, where you'll see researchers going into the jungle and living with the gorilla. They are not the gorilla. Humans are never the gorilla. So we can only be living and hoping that we're part of the community. And that's where we say we're living with them in order to be part of them. But this is still a temporary arrangement because we can never be them, that kind of thing. So again, ethnography has a tendency to express that it's a much longer period. And longer period does not mean 2 or 3 months. It means in terms of years. So you literally have to live there for 2 years. So if we were studying a company, then the researcher would have to be there full time for 2 years to really say we are living in the community and living with the rest of them, and we're sort of part of them, even though we're not necessarily them. So something to sort of remember, that eventually the person will leave. So they're not necessarily an employee, but again, you might see someone who is an employee in the company, but they may not be necessarily working in that specific division and where the change is being observed and being monitored and being collected. So that's also quite an important distinction in itself. It's not just because you're an employee, therefore you must be doing ethnography. No, it really depends on whether you are part of the thing that you are observing in that phenomenon, in that field. So when we go and look at archival research, and there is archival research in qualitative research, is basically reconstructing the field. And the key thing about this is looking at historical records, and largely because we won't be able to interview people back in the 1700s, 1800s, or early 1900s. And that's what reconstructing what had happened. So there are quite a few papers that's sort of quite good in illustrating this, like the Martin Quinn paper, where he went and sort of reconstructed the whole situation based on the Guinness Stout from 1759 to 2010. So several hundred years, so reconstructing that. And Paul Anton and Clinton Free did 2 separate studies, but collecting the same data, where they reconstructed it based on newspaper articles, based on what had happened in the particular sports, sports scandal and saga. So reconstructing what had happened there. So this is quite an interesting one, where why do we say what research strategy we took? Because we need to disclose what was the mindset or intention of the researcher when they went into the field to collect the data. So very important sort of distinction between living and visiting and interfering. Let's look at the positivists and interpretativists. The simplest way to explain this is one thing. In the positivist world, they look at good case study design being very vital. Now, in the interpretivist world, you'll notice that in the method section, they take a lot of time and sort of intention in describing the case. So they're trying to describe the case to make it more plausible, to make it more sort of applicable in that sense. And what do? They use multiple sources of evidence. They will look at the documents, they'll look at what was publicly sort of disclosed in the newspaper and the media, for example, as well as interviewing people, and also sort of trying to collate the different interviewees saying what. But also, they try to have a very clear description of what one had done and how they went about doing it in terms of the data collection. So you'll tend to be able to get the sense of it even when you're reading the methods itself in a particular paper, whether the authors have taken a positivist sort of route versus an interpretivist route. So that's quite an interesting one, because then you get the sense of how the researchers have operated and how they go about explaining the results. And you also find the positivist tends to go closer to the way survey results are being reported and presented as well. Just closer, not exactly the same, but just closer in that sense. Now, when you're designing the questions to ask in an interview, what is also important is a lot of time, somehow, I don't know how, but there is a misconception that when one is doing a research interview, it's an interrogation, but it's not. The right way of interviewing in a research is actually having a conversation. So the person should not even realize you are actually interviewing them. And that's probably the nice thing about it. If they feel comfortable, and because it's having a conversation, they are able to share with you exactly what is going on by reconstructing and telling you what they are thinking or how things have occurred as they see it in the world they lived in. Now, what is important to understand is the interview questions is not the same as a research question. And likewise, a survey question is not the same as the hypothesis statement that we see in papers. So it is very important that do not assume that everything is the same, because they are not, and they shouldn't be. And if you look at the way the number of interviews being reported in terms of how many interviews being conducted and the length of interviews, you could literally tell whether the authors are following a positivist route or an interpretivist route. But there are situations where it looks very grey, and that's probably because the person is a bit confused about which route they're taking, and that often do happen when PhD students are starting off and going about learning the whole process as well. But what is most important is never force the words into your research participant, and it didn't matter whether it's an interview question or survey question. For example, certain conceptual words should be avoided, and certain words that have multiple meaning should be avoided. The best example I talk about is the word control. You never ask the CEO, so how do you go about controlling your staff member? Because you might get very different responses because of the way they interpret the word control. And likewise, you would never want to ask an employee, so how does the CEO, your boss, control you? And that doesn't go down well either. So very important thing of trying to use very neutral words as much as possible. And that's also important in terms of trying to make it like a conversation. Now, in this particular paper that was published in the Australian Journal of Management, I quite like this. It comes from someone's finance PhD. But the fact is, in her research question, she's trying to understand why would people even go about sort of going into the fishing industry despite that there are less and less fishes in the sea. So they're depleting fishing resources. And yet, when you look at the interview guide she has provided, you'll notice that she asks about owning the boat, acquiring the boat, but you never see the word, so there are less fish out there. So she never does that. So this is a very important strategy to have in mind, is you try not to put words into your interviewees because you try to let them tell you what's going on. Otherwise, you're actually leading them to a particular path you're looking for instead of getting a very natural sense of what is happening in the phenomenon in which you are investigating on. And in that particular audit paper in the auditing journal, it's a top-ranking auditing journal, it's quite interesting. They talk about 5 particular challenges behind the interview-based research and the methods in which one could cope with it. And I really love the first one where they talk about designing the interview questions when we don't know what we don't know. So this is very tricky for someone to go into a field and ask and interview people if they don't understand the field. So you could see that happening with a lot of students struggling with that because of the lack of life experience or the lack of actual industry working experience in the actual field in which they're going into. So if somebody has actually worked in the company, worked in these types of company before, even as short as 1 year, at least they have some insider knowledge and understanding, and also the understanding of the jargons and the words in order to make it like a conversation. So this is quite an important one, to not look like you don't know what you don't know, but at least try to look like you know something rather than you really have no clue in it. So this is quite an important one, is if the more conferences, exactly like a practitioner conference, the more you attend and listen to a practitioner speak, at least you might get a sense of how they view the world, so that it makes it easier when you are entering the field and interviewing the people working in the field in itself. And this is quite an interesting one, in terms of making sure you are successful there. But the paper do go through and explain, hey, trying to go from, a lot of interview transcript, and a 1 hour interview would easily sort of become 15 pages long of interview transcript in Word. So how do you go about organizing it, analyzing and making sense of it when you've got so much data? And how do you actually organize it and present the end results to, in the paper and write it up? And then when it comes to the review process in the academic journals, that in itself is a whole new world, a whole different world, because if you get a reviewer who is not necessarily a qualitative researcher, it becomes quite problematic in terms of the mismatch of understanding of the method, especially with the research strategy, but also most importantly, if you are an interpretivist researcher and your work is being reviewed by a positivist researcher, there is a conflicting mindset behind how that type of research in terms of interviews should be conducted. So this is quite an important thing for you to bear in mind, that the two different views actually do not see eye to eye in that sense. So very important thing to understand that. So if you do understand your reviewer is coming from a different mind, it makes it easier for you sort of gauge and understand where they're coming from in order to respond accordingly. So hopefully I've given you a sort of a nice background to how things are, but I think it's important to understand, interview is the most common one, but it's not restricted to that itself. And we're trying to ask as much of the deeper question of the how and why. And it's a nice, good method. It's equally reliable and valid, depending on how you describe it. So it's important that you describe how you went about collecting the data to make people feel comfortable and being able to rely on it. But it's important that, despite the small sample size, it is the importance of getting the richness of it. And that's why the length of the interviews makes a huge difference, because then you can delve enough detail into it. So somebody presenting 200 interviews with only an average time of 20 minutes, I could tell you're not going to get a good sense about what is going on compared to if someone who's done 30 interviews with an average length of, say, 90 minutes, for example. So there's quite a big contrast and extreme in that sense. Now, when it comes to writing, you'll see that most journals have a word limit, so you'll be writing the same regardless qualitative or quantitative. So that myth, don't even think about that one is less than the other when it comes to writing. Nicely there, summarize the whole thing and look at the quotes that are being presented and disclosed in the papers across these 7 particular journals that's been reported. But what I thought was interesting is in the early 2000s and then going through the 2005, 2009 versus the 2010 and 2014, you'll see there was a significant increase in the 2 early timings. And then there's a slight moderate increase in the more recent years. So that's quite an interesting phenomenon that suddenly there was a big jump in including interview quotes in the papers that's been published. But if you look sort of more sort of into it, you'll notice that some of the journals are a bit different in that sense. It didn't quite increase. It may have actually decreased, such as in UoAuckland and JMAR. And JMAR was a bit interesting in itself that the medium had dropped from 15.5 quotes down to 5. And yet, when you look at the mean, it went up by 15.5 to 17.5 quotes being presented and disclosed in the research paper. And then critical perspective of accounting and the AOS journal instead have actually increased in terms of the number of quotes that's been reported in the papers in itself. So I thought that was quite an interesting sort of understanding for people writing and reporting on interview study. Now, when it comes to the different types of authors in the method section, now this is a very important phenomenon in itself of understand positivist and interpretivist mindset coming in. What sort of direction the authors, the researchers are coming with. And yet, this is probably the most interesting bit the paper had presented, and even the authors are very confused by what they discover, because the influence of positivist authors in these particular journals that's recognized as not being highly sympathetic to positive thinking, such as the UoAuckland and critical perspective, what is interesting is they actually found that the positivist authors have appeared being cited in the research method. And they're saying, oh, this is not looking too great. What is going on? What are we seeing that's going in there? And I must admit, having done the same mistake myself several years ago, a lot of times the authors or the authors of the research methods, they don't necessarily disclose that, hey, I'm a positivist, or hey, I'm an interpretivist, because we don't actually disclose and spell it out. A lot of times PhD students do not realize that. And I certainly went through not knowing there is a big difference between the two camps, and then just basically citing someone, for example, I've cited a lot for many, many years, not realizing that he's actually a positivist, and yet the way I analyze and report on my findings is actually going down to interpretivist. And so this actually sort of confirmed the fact that a lot of us are confused between the two, because we actually do not get the disclosure of one is actually going with. Now, when it comes to the data coding, it's becoming popular where people describe and disclose sort of which software they use and how they go about the data coding. And that data coding itself, it's been a rapid growth in disclosing and mentioning of the practice. And there's a huge variation in terms of the more recent years, 2010 and 2014. And yet, one of the key things where the data coding practice became more and more important, because it is largely mentioned in journals by and large positivists, such as the JMAR and sort of critical perspective, because and yet they are least recognized in this critical perspective journal in that sense. So whether you're taking a positivist or the interpretivist mindset, it actually influences the way you actually do or disclose the data coding. So data coding, I mean, the purpose of it is help you organize the data, but it doesn't really analyze the data per se. It still requires the human to go about interpreting or understanding what the interviewees are telling us. So hopefully that gives you a nice sort of understanding and roundup to how the whole positivist and the interpretive will work. And coming back to the number of interviews being disclosed, because you will see that particular positive thinking coming in, especially when you've got 120 interviews, 189 interviews being cited in the actual paper in itself. So this is quite an interesting sort of thought to think about it. And especially looking at the more recent years, comparing to some have increased versus some have decreased compared to what the median and mean actually look like. With that in mind, hopefully that sort of gives you a broad understanding of how an interview study should be designed and how to actually design and conduct it. And at the end, how do you go about describing it and including it in terms of the interview quotes in the paper that you're writing up in itself. So when we talk about findings, we're trying to describe it. We do start with the storytelling because that is a nice place to start, because you're trying to tell what is going on in the interview data you have found and actually collected. So you're trying to summarize what they say, and you should use the interview quotes to support in a very meaningful way. Now, when you are drafting the paper or drafting your thesis, you should include as many quotes, and you should have it from every informant or from every informant group that you have in there, just depending on the size of how many interviews you have. But when you're finalizing it in terms of the actual sort of paper submitting to a journal, that's when you decide and choose the quotes accordingly. And at the same time, do use the little pen and paper sort of situation where you count and ensure you are disclosing a fair sort of distribution among your informants or groups, just so that you don't sort of suddenly show you've been biased to what certain informants or certain groups. So you do need to make sure you need to choose the quotes accordingly, but making sure that everyone had a fair chance to be featured and use quotes to be presented in there. But what is also important to know is the positivist will come down a similar route to the survey where they try to count. But if you are taking an interpretivist view of interpreting the meaning of what the interviewees are telling you and saying to you, then avoid the counting, because that doesn't go down well. Because you'll have reviewers complaining and going, I don't like you counting because this is not interview study. The other thing is when we finish off describing the interview findings, this is where we make connections from our story to the specific theory or framework. And we're trying to apply the concept of theorizing, just like you were describing why the apple fell off the tree, because that is following the theory of the gravity. Now, what is important to understand is the data should remain as it is, because that's what you've collected. But the theory could be changed, because if we find that one particular theory is not that great in explaining what we've discovered, we should change the theory and change the way we describe and match it. So hopefully that gives you a nice rounding up from storytelling all the way through to describing an interview in terms of theorizing what you have found in the field. So that's all from me, David. Back to you in terms of hopefully people's got some questions to come about.
Fantastic, Angela. And we do have some time for questions, folks. You can either put them in the chat, or I'm really happy to take people's questions from the floor as well. Has anyone got any questions before I use the chair's prerogative? Because I've got one or two.
And also, do you want me to stop sharing the slides?
Yeah, that's probably the easiest, so that we can all see each other. Thank you. So, Angela, I guess while people get their thoughts together on questions, one of the things that really does occur to me, and I was really interested in the slide that you put up where you showed the declining rates of responses over quite an extensive period, which I thought was really interesting. And it kind of suggested to me a few things. One was that obviously technology means that there's much greater opportunity for researching and connecting with people. So the extent to which that represents research exhaustion on the part of participants is probably a key question. Perhaps the next key question, or where you might have some comments, is how do you avoid that process? So for instance, do you try and incorporate as many questions as you can into a particular project, or do you get very, very narrow and focused on a project in order to get the answers that you're looking for?
Ooh, tricky. I think it's important to keep the interview question as broad as possible. I think the survey is a bit different because you do have to have everything pre-written and ready to go, and so that doesn't look very nice when you receive an interview with receive a survey with 100 questions in there. So I think that interviewers provide a nice sort of alternative to it, as many sort of previous survey researchers have found, because depending on the person's background and the person's role and ability response, then you could literally retailor your interview according to the person. So
Yeah.
I've definitely gone into an interview where I knew the person could only answer one of my interview question, for example, on training. But this person will be able enough to give me a lot of detail, in-depth sort of responses in terms of how they went about providing training to the staff member in the firm, for example. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And Alan Gray's has put a great question in the chat box. Can you please suggest a manual for grounded theory?
Unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to give you any advice on that. I'm not a grounded theory person. And I'll be honest and say, I also discovered that there is a lot of sort of debate and sort of arguments, I should say. So where some people say, you know, these days you can't really be truly going into the field with no theory in mind and completely grounded. So do have that in mind, that there are certain researchers out there that disagree with this sort of viewpoint. So in a way, I literally would avoid the word grounded theory, because, you know, regardless of how, it's the way you describe your data or describe your phenomenon should be based on what you have observed and what you have interviewed and discovered. I think that's what you should really be focusing on, rather than too hung up by the whole point that you are honestly entering the field with no theory in mind. Because sometimes you might think you're going to build your own theory, but at the same time, you might discover someone else already have a theory that actually matches. Because I know that had happened where people were arguing with me that, hey, such and such a theory already exists that could actually explain what you're trying to do, and I disagree with you coming up with a new theory to explain that. So just bear that in mind. So there are certain words I avoid, and grounded theory is one. And the other one is probably the ethnography, because there are some purists and there are the rest of us that are not necessarily purists. Yeah.
Fantastic, Angela. That's great. Penny York, my colleague here at UWA, has also posited a question, which is, thanks, Angela, great presentation, which I'm sure we'll all agree with. Curious about the statement to avoid counting how many informants make similar statements in the last slide. Doesn't that demonstrate how deeply something is being experienced and how relevant it is to your discussion?
Yeah, because what I found that is, when people start counting, we get to the point of we keep counting. And I notice that happens with a lot of students all the time, where they go 3 out of 5 of my interview said this, 2 out of 4 of my interview said this. It creates a point where you're going down the track of trying to present your data as though you were doing a survey. And I could assure you, you'll get a no-no when the review process come about. So what I'm trying to say is, if this was quite, you know, a common, and a lot of people are suggesting and hinting that, do not try to make it where every time you talk about something, you say, you know, 2 out of 4, 3 out of 5, that kind of sort of counting exercise. So you got to be smart about the way you choose the words to describe what you're finding, whether this is something that everyone is sort of discovering versus it's all half and half, that kind of thing. So just be a bit careful of not making it sound like a survey when you are actually doing an interview study.
Fantastic. Thank you, Angela. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll leave it there. It is we have run out of time. It's 11 o'clock on the West Coast, 1 p.m. on the East Coast of Australia. And in New Zealand, I think that makes it 2 p.m. 3 p.m. Sorry, Angela, 3 p.m. My gosh. It's been fantastic having so many people from different countries here, as well as having Angela from New Zealand to be able to present on what is, I think, a really important topic in relation to not-for-profits generally and across research generally as well, the importance of qualitative research and how to go about that in a way that ensures the outcomes are achieved appropriately is a really important topic. So thank you, Angela. I really appreciate it. We will distribute the slides to the registrants as well as the video via our YouTube and our website. So look out for that in due course. And I'll also please look out for the next session, which will be advertised shortly, I'm sure. Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you particularly, Angela, for your contribution today. We really appreciate it. Cheers.
Thank you so much for having me, David.
Pleasure.